Thank you to all of you who have come. Thank you, Dr. Flores, for coming and for making some room from your very busy schedule to visit us. It's really an honor. Let me share with you some of the achievements that Professor Flores has undergone. So Professor Flores is chair of the English department at the Appalachian State University. He taught at the English department at the University of Puerto Rico, Maya West campus from 1994 to 2019. He's the president of the Electronic Literature Organization. That's how I got to meet him. And then he was the 2012-2013 Fulbright Scholar in Digital Culture at the University of Bergen in Norway. His research areas are electronic literature and its preservation via criticism, documentation, and digital archives. He's the creator of a scholarly blogging project titled I Love Poetry, and co-editor of the Electronic Literature Collection, Volume 3, that my students have been using. It's open access, free access, and he's also contributes to the Spanish language elite column in 80 Grados. 80 Grados is an independent magazine, journal magazine in Puerto Rico. Lately, he has been extremely busy trying to compile with some colleagues an anthology of e-literature from Latin America. So, from your busy schedule, we really thank you that you are here. And I'm sure it's going to be an electrifying presentation.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you all for coming. I hope we have some fun here and you get to learn a little bit about electronic literature and really why it's important. I titled this Turning the Page, and its focus will be primarily Latinx born digital literature, but the core concept is the idea that the page exerts control over us, over how we think about writing, about what are our tastes in reading. We're used to putting words in sequences and then reading them. And the history of writing and the history of publication technologies have shaped us for a few hundred years in those tastes, those aesthetics, and the very fields of English and literature studies in any language, really. We have been shaped by the world of print. So what I want to think about is, and what I want to provoke in all of you is the thought of what happens when we start to leave behind the page and think, what can these digital machines do? What can they do well? Because, well, they're these wonderful devices that we read increasingly on and write increasingly on, and yet we're still kind of bound up by the page. I'll explain, well, you'll see. So let's think about what shapes writing as a practice, right? There's technologies of writing, and we're gonna go kind of way back on writing technologies. We're gonna look at these writing technologies as we write things with these technologies. Genres develop. We have manuscripts. We have print. These are sort of, ways in which to this day we still express ourselves in writing. For the most part, we've been working with analog technologies. But now that we're working with digital technologies, how can that affect it? So let's get pre-digital. Let's kind of set the stage, because I think we have naturalized the page. We have naturalized the book and print media. We think of it as these really, invisible, effortless, natural kind of things, when in reality, we have invested as a society years of training in our educational system for us to learn how to read and write, and that shapes how we think about it. So let's go way back to the beginnings of writing. cuneiform and hieroglyphs, right? Carving on clay tablets, making marks on and inscriptions on stone as writing systems. So some of the earliest writing systems we know of come from these traditions. Once we are able to, and of course, stone has this really powerful durability, clay tablets as well. But pretty early on in different parts of the world, they learned to create paper, which is a lot more portable, and then the different technologies to lay ink on paper. So there's some ancient writing systems that rely on that, and we'll see some more contemporary ones. In the age of manuscript, copies were made, right? And you know, this was usually what scribes, monastic scribes in churches, ordinary people didn't have access to writing. They didn't get to learn basic literacy skills. And it was priests copying on scrolls, on skins, on paper, making manuscript copies. As writing became more popularized, you get the rise of the author, right? You get the more people are writing, and suddenly they're telling stories. It's going beyond sort of legal, official, and religious uses, and it becomes, we get really some of the beginnings of the very concept of the author, such as William Shakespeare, for instance. And some of these, you know, may have used feathers and quills and ink. And these technologies, right, the fountain pen, that's a technology. The ballpoint pen is a technology of writing. And each one affects how people's relation to writing. Okay, I'm going kind of quickly on this so we can really spend some time on some of the digital stuff. So as we learn to write, right, we tend to think of the blank page as this sort of, you know, anything goes, right? It's this wide open space. You can just write wherever. And we frequently do, right? But of course, we're trained, right? When you look at ruled paper, this is training us to leave margins, to write in rows, right? Not to write around the paper, not to draw, right? This really kind of focuses on text and textual production in certain ways. So even when we use the blank page, remember this. This is telling us how to write, how to organize it. Another thing that regularizes writing is printing, the printing press. Here's a model of an old Gutenberg-style press where, you know, you arrange type and stamp on paper so you can make multiple copies of something. And the age of print really revolutionized access to writing and the book, and really brought on, was the beginnings of an age of mass literacy. Now, when we print texts, we're used to seeing something like this. Here's a famous poem by William Blake called The Tiger. And it's a wonderful poem. Most people, how many of you have read this, like maybe in a class, in a textbook? Okay, handful of you, good. So the tiger, I mean, this is how we're used to seeing the tiger. And the tiger, and print in general, translates manuscript into these kind of regularized texts that are then stamped on paper and circulated that way. But the reason we understand texts to be this is because it was convenient. It was a limitation of the technology of print to really be able to do more. And this is how it was economically viable. William Blake did not write this poem. Well, he wrote this poem. Of course he wrote this poem, and this is the text of the poem. But when he wrote it, he didn't write it like this. He wrote it like this. He had these illuminated, basically he would create these use these copper plates and etch the words, do the art, and add acid to deepen the grooves. He would write everything backwards, And then he would use those copper printing plates, I'll show you in a sec, how, to really produce these, and then he would hand paint them. And so really the text that he wrote was intended to be read like this. If you extract the text, you are giving an incomplete version. You are losing information, okay? So, and he did multiple versions. And every printing, every hand painting had its own different take. You could see that these tigers, I mean, that one looks pretty fearsome, whereas this one is more like a scared kitty or something like that, right? And this one is a little more, we can interpret this in different ways, but the whole point is even having the printing product that he produced, these illuminated texts, they were expensive to produce, they were labor intensive, it wasn't practical. So just stamping text on a page, that's a lot more practical. This is how he created these, in copper plates, written backwards, and stamped them and colored. Now, as print technology develops, we get authors such as, oh my God, Stéphane Mallarmé, who wrote Un coup de dé, jamais n'abolira les hasards. A toss of the dice will never abolish chance. And as he was writing this poem, he was writing it in a way that he would give careful instructions to the printer to produce it the way he wanted it to be. This is late 19th century France. Typography was becoming experimental and a lot more interesting in many ways, and he wanted to take advantage of that, and he wrote a poem that font sizes, arrangement, really kind of challenged how people read. We're used to reading left to right, top to bottom. Here, in some of these pages, you have to make choices as to where you read next. Futurism, not far behind, early 20th century, you get some really nice typographical experimentation by the futurists and others. And of course, the invention of the typewriter did something really important. The typewriter allowed poets like William Carlos Williams and Gwendolyn Brooks and others to write space. You see, when you are writing by hand, you can be as meticulous as Mallarmé did and say, I want these words here and there. But for the most part, the convention was you would turn in a manuscript to a printer. The printer would translate that into print, would regularize punctuation, spacing, line breaks, and produce a print edition. William Carlos Williams really used a typewriter. You can actually measure space by how many times you hit that space bar. It's measurable. When Carlos Williams turned in a typescript, not a manuscript, manu is hand, right? Manuscript. This typescript he would turn in were precise instructions to the printer to replicate that. And therefore, he worked with language that way. Gwendolyn Brooks as well did some really neat stuff with these enjambments, right, and these line breaks. She had very precise control. Concrete poetry. In Latin America, this is a poem by Eugen Gomringer titled Silencio. The translation is not difficult. Silencio means silence. Let's read this poem real quick. Silencio, silencio, silencio. Silencio, silencio, silencio. Silencio, silencio. Silencio, silencio, silencio. Silencio, silencio, silencio. Did you hear the silence? Where's the silence? Where's the silence? In the middle. All right. Are there any other silences? At the end of each line, you could hear the pause, right? That silence as I became. Silencio, 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 3 times, right? Good. What else?
Page.
Hmm?
On page. Everywhere.
On the page. Absolutely. I mean, there's silences between words. There's a silence before I start reading and the silence when I finish reading. The white page, the blank page, is silence, right? So writing is noise, and the blank page is silence, of course. So you can't have words without silence. That's what defines the space between a word, right? If not, it just turn into a jumble. So part of what I want to challenge is the idea that the blank page is silence. I think it has a lot of noise, but it's a silent noise. You'll see. Children's books frequently are not, they're written in color, they're interactive, they are multimodal, in other words, they can incorporate images and text. Sometimes they have pop-up things, and sometimes they have interactive things, right? And you can like really play with them. Notice it's not working off of the concept of the blank white page, but it's full of color. Books can take many, many formats. Artist books question and interrogate the very standard formats that we're used to, such as the codex, which is the printed book with a spine that we turn pages. Books can take many, many shapes. Books can even be hypertextual. This poem is called 100,000 milliards de poèmes, 100,000 billion poems. I might be mistranslating, but the idea is Raymond Queneau in the 60s wrote basically 10 sonnets. A sonnet is a 14-line poem. They're one behind the other, but then he cut each line, right? So the edition is cut so that each line is its own page. And you basically create, as you turn it, it creates the possibility of 10 to the power of 14 possible permutations. They did the calculation, and it would take over 200,000 years to read all of the possible permutations of this poem, even if you were reading 24 hours a day. So he created a work that's impossible to fully read. He created a work that its combinatorial possibilities just exploded mathematically, exponentially. So notice how we're already kind of, when you cut the page, suddenly you can start doing other things, right? Let's explore this further. Traditional book format allows, I don't know if you know adventure books or choose your own adventure books, but these popular books from the 70s and 80s gave you ways to choose and navigate to different pages and find 216 different stories and different endings, and you'd explore this wonderful text. So the book had been wanting to be hypertextual before hypertext really was a thing, or digital hypertext really became a thing. Books also wanted to be multimodal, multimedia. So Always Coming Home and La Ley del Amor by Laura Esquivel as well were books that were published with a tape so that you would play it at certain times and listen to certain music and poetry at certain moments in the book. So it was trying to kind of go beyond just the silence of the page. Of course, that silence, when we read it out loud, it turns into wonderful noise, right? And music even. So notice how really towards the late age of print, and I would say we're still in the late age of print, we want to go beyond what the book can do. But still, there are some formats that are recognized that we, magazines, newspapers, books are some of the genres that are most recognized that we keep going back to. And I don't think they're going to go away They have their space and their value and their importance, but they still shape how we think about and how we use digital technologies. So let's look at some of the digital writing technologies. Just down the road at University of Maryland College Park, Matt Kirschenbaum is a professor of English. He published a book recently called Track Changes, A Literary History of Word Processing. And this here is one of the early word processors, a Wang, that was used to produce texts. Now, notice that in many ways what's happening here is you're getting the typewriter, and the production has become a little more virtual, but the end is the same. You hit print, and it produces a print copy, right? And the design of these machines are to produce a print copy. Here's an example of what WordStar looks like. Most recently, WordStar became famous because George R.R. Martin was talking about how he composed on a WordStar. Now, I want to point something out up here. You see where it says insert a return? The return key? You know, we all have them on our computers. Sometimes it's called enter. Sometimes it's called return. Do you know why it's called return? Because of typewriters. See that thing that's moving from one end to the other? That's the carriage. And when you typed and reached the end of the line, you would hit return or carriage return, and the carriage would snap back. So the carriage would return to the beginning. You could continue typing. And yet it's an important part of programming and computation and computers. So again, the technologies of the past still shape our present. Now, computers develop, they become more colorful and personal. You have in the 80s and late 70s and 80s games, text adventure games that are essentially hypertexts. You have programs like HyperCard that allow you to link things together. Story Space as well allows you, you get the sort of early age of hypertext. But still, for the most part, they're producing static text that we navigate from one space to another. So what they're changing is the organization and the interface on how we turn from page to page. Instead of being linear, it's more link-driven. Now, as computers continue to develop and we start getting virtual keyboards, right? They become lighter. You have things like iPads, and you add keyboards so you can type better and easier to them. And then most recently, what was hailed as a great invention, the Apple Pencil. Suddenly, we can now write on the page like manuscript and draw and scribble. I mean, it wasn't a great invention. It was taken away by the technical possibilities and limitations of the past and then brought back based on newer technologies, right? So again, this great advance in Apple's interface design really is a return to the page. Okay? Progress or nostalgia re-implemented in contemporary spaces. We return to the same places, maybe a little further along in capabilities. We type on these keyboards, and yet you see here's a BlackBerry, and here's a virtual keyboard. Notice that they used a QWERTY design. Do you know why the QWERTY design was designed as it was? It was so the keys, whenever you hit a typewriter, the letters would be stamped on the page through the ink ribbon. I'll show you a bit of what that looks like. But they were spread around so that your main fingers touched the most important letters, but also so that things wouldn't jam as they stamped on the page. So if you're typing too quickly, if you did A through Z, they were getting jammed up. So they had to be spread around on the layout of this typewriter. Yet, to this day, even with virtual keyboards, we're doing QWERTY, but you can't put your hands on that iPhone and type. So again, notice how these technologies are still shaped by the past. The concept I'm driving at is that the page exerts a kind of hegemonic control. Now, for those of you who may not know the term, we're talking about a kind of cultural, aesthetic, social pressure, the values that are bound up with the page and the literature that was created for the page affect how we shape and produce in digital media, right? So writing is obeying the rules established by the world of print. The blank page represents silence. Good job. And is symbolically an empty space that can receive writing art ideas. Letters and words are arranged in static sequences that follow established conventions. Heck, you can see this at work in this PowerPoint. Writing can coexist with images on the page, but is generally in less serious popular genres. So, you know, comics, yeah, that's you know, that's not so good. Go write a novel. That has more value. Though, I must say, comics and graphic novels have really come to their own. And the book is supposed to, well, it's a format designed to support textual immersion. So, and I think that is one of the things that it does very powerfully. When you lose yourself in a book, right, books don't give you notifications. They don't interrupt your flow. And the page, whether it's real or virtual, is considered still to this day the most important space for the circulation of the written word. So when we fire up Microsoft Word, we get a virtual page. And notice, here's a fun little thing I ran into just last week in social media. Uppercase letters comes from a print convention in which the typography set of letters that the printer had, the capital letters were put on the upper part of the case, and therefore they're called uppercase. Also, the typewriter keys that stamp through the button, the shift button that we still use, it was to shift the direction so that it would stamp with the capital X rather than the lowercase x, or the capital S instead of the lower s. So the shift key was actually mechanically shifting things so it would stamp the other letter. And yet we still use shift and caps locks and things like that, and we still talk about uppercase. Kindle devices replicate the page. They spent a lot of money getting that paper-white technology, that e-ink technology, so it wouldn't cause fatigue in the eyes and people could still lose themselves in the books, right? When we first started creating things for publication on the web, we called them web pages, right? Again, the page. This is very 90s. Yeah. And there was a tag called, an HTML tag called the blink tag, and it was, yeah. Anyways, even to this day, right, we've come a long way. And they talk about responsive texts and responsive design. And the idea is that it can deliver a fairly consistent text no matter what device size you have. It adjusts and responds to it. All right. Let's get to electronic literature and digital writing, because to have the computational power of an iPhone, really, this is a powerful pocket computer, and to use it just to produce text and read text the way it was done before is like using it just to make phone calls while it's tethered to a line. In other words, it's a terrible misuse of its potential. So, 4 main types of digital writing. There's more. I just want to focus on these 4. Computational, right? When you're writing in a digital environment, you can have computation. multimodal, integrating different images, sound, text, interactive through keyboard, mouse, accelerometers, cameras, microphones, and networked, connected to data on the stream, other users on the web. Now, computational writing, the two biggest genres are generative writing and bots. So the very first work of electronic literature that we know of is Christopher Strachey's love letter generator, created on the Ferranti Mark I computer at Manchester University. This right here is Alan Turing, who collaborated and worked with Christopher Strachey at the time. Now, when they ran that program, it would produce these kinds of love letters. So for example, this is a web implementation. Dearest love, you are my passionate craving, my breathless fellow feeling, my longing likes your devotion, my fondness holds dear your desire, you are my passionate hunger, yours ardently, M.U.C., Manchester University computer. They would print these out and put them in bulletin boards all around campus, and people just were so charmed. And and notice that here's the variables, and here's some of the data set on how it's put together. And you can find this on the web and run it and generate some love letters. I know you're finding out after Valentine's Day, so I can't help you there. But yeah, there's a whole book series right now called Using Electricity, where, for example, Rafael Pérez y Pérez with Mexica, this was a program he wrote 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, in Pascal, still runs in Pascal, and basically generates these narratives of Aztec warriors and princesses. It's like really, really neat stuff. And there's so many wonderful books in that series. This is a generative poem that Milton Laufer wrote called God. It's based on that song God by John Lennon. And I have 3 different iterations of when you run it, right, it'll produce these texts. So God is a fuel by which we measure our possession. I'll say it again. God is a possession by which we measure our revenue. I don't believe in managers. I don't believe in devices. I don't believe in partners. I don't believe in causes. I don't believe in standards. I don't believe in moods. I don't believe in feelings. I just believe in me, computers, and me. And then it keeps generating. God is a performance by which we measure our bottle. I'll say it again. God is a cause by which we measure our form. I don't believe in languages. I don't believe in strings, and so on. You can see the pattern, right? You can see the shape. This is a program that is, I think, 1K in size. This was published in an online magazine called Taper, which is about these minimal programs generating poetry and stories and all these things. Now let's talk about bots. Bots are, think of a robot, but a software robot, kind of personified, right? The very first bot is ELIZA by Joseph Weizenbaum up in MIT. And ELIZA is a chat bot. Basically, it ran a script called Doctor, in which someone using a teletype could have a conversation with the program. You'd type, and then it would type back a response. And it was a first serious attempt at passing the Turing test. In other words, making someone think that they were having a conversation with a human being. So, and well, this is the, let's say, great-grandmother of bots. Nowadays, we have a ton of Twitter bots, for example. And bots in general have been used for all kinds of bad purposes. I'm more interested in the sort of artistic and literary bots. So, for instance, Pentametron, which was running until they deactivated it just about a year ago, would detect tweets that happened to be in iambic pentameter. I don't know if you know what iambic pentameter is from your English classes, right? Da 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 da. So when it detects a tweet that is an iambic pentameter, it holds it on a database, and it waits for another tweet in iambic pentameter that rhymes with the other one, and it retweets both at the same time, essentially creating couplets, rhyming couplets in iambic pentameter, and it did that for like, I don't know, 7 to 9 years. And one of the books in using electricity is Sonnets from Pentametron. So all these bots operate independently. They use different kinds of techniques. I'll show you one by Elica Ortega, a Mexican poet. This is called Bot Carrion. It's inspired by Ulises Carrion's The New Art of Making Books from 1975. And she also has this other one called Poesías, Ulises Carrion Poesías Bot. I'll just show you this one. It generates these statements. This book by Ulises Carrion is this kind of manifesto book, making statements and pronouncements about art and books. So it generates every 3 hours and tweets things like, in the new art, a writer may not be the accidental container of a text where nothing happens. In the old art, a writer is not the true ground of communication taking place through words. Here begins the new art of making books. In the old art, reading may be identical with the preceding ones, although very little. In the old art, a page may be an enigma, a problem. And with this, poetry has lost nothing. Here's another bot that's very popular, Magic Realism Bot. It generates the plots of stories in the Magic Realism tradition. So an undertaker memorizes the location of every prime number in Wisconsin. Or a mosquito is exacting revenge upon the death penalty. Or a Macedonian huntsman invents a new philosophy based on the movement of elephants. Or a dental hygienist dances with the universe inside a glass motel. I mean, think about any of these premises, right, as a tool for creativity. If we're to take that premise and run with it, right, it excites the imagination. So let's talk about multimodality, right? We have multimedia works, we have kinetic writing, we have memes. 1965, Eduardo Darino produces on one of the early machines that he had access to this text that is made with words. He used punch cards, he would print it out, and then did film photography. He basically created a short film, an art film, that created the animation. So again, computation was happening at an early stage in terms of printing things out with that kind of palette. But this caminante, also known as correcaminos, later he was able to re-implement it in BASIC and have it run as an animation, and then later it was re-implemented in Flash. And what we have here is a GIF of the Flash. So again, some of these old versions stop working, and we do some archaeology. Organismo by Decio Pignatari. O organismo quer repetir, o organismo, orgasm, oh, what? 1960, it was animated. This is a concrete poet. And if we were to try to translate it, right, it would go something like this. O organism that wants to perdure. O organism wants to repeat. O organism. Orgasm? Are we zooming in? But it's changing. It's not quite zooming in, right? It's creating this sequence about organisms and how maybe they perdure, how they repeat, how they want, want. Anipoemas. Ana Maria Uribe in 1997 created this series of poems. She's an Argentinian, came from the concrete poetry tradition, And one of the things that she did was she started using typography, creating GIFs in the 90s, the early animation technology, and making this about centaurs, or this one called Jim, where in presenting words in the same location and sequences, it looks like it's people at a gym exercising. Here's a little more of that concept. That LZ, is it? Oh wait, you can't see it. Oh no, here I thought I was showing you something. Here we go. Let's see. Let's go back to PowerPoint. Here I am looking at all these poems. Is this a PowerPoint? No. Let's go, wait. All right, there. Cut it out, and here we are. Here's the centaurs I was talking about. A herd of centaurs. Here's the Jim poem. So here are the words twisting around, right? Exercising. Look at this one. Look at that L, right? Twisting. That P, R, right? M, W. What's going on there, right? This one's stretching that leg, right? Look at this one, spring. You take some P's and some Q's and you start drawing with them and you get yourself spring, right? In a brief animation. So these are kind of little sketches, right? Little proofs of concept where she's using this kind of typography, putting it in an animated space and creating wonderful things. Let's go back here to our presentation. And did I completely lose my spot? Hang on. Well, let's just skip all the way to let's get to Uribe. Almost there. All right, we're there. Bam. All right. Botcarrion, Caminante, Organismo, and Poemas. Now, Fabio Doktorovich, also Argentinian, 1998 creates this poem called ASTWZ. It's part of a series of poems about Auschwitz and concentration camps. Notice that here he's using this kind of virtual reality modeling language. Very rudimentary from the 90s. They called it vermal at the time. But have you ever thought about how the thickness of a word, of a letter? I mean, we tend to think of them as these two-dimensional objects stamped on a page. What happens when you write something that is moving, circulating in space, rotating in different angles that have a thickness and a depth? Memes. This is a popular meme, right? The woman yelling at the cat. So is this, who's saying GIF and who's saying GIF? I won't start any controversies here. I want to keep this clean. But this one was one that I made. I think part of what's interesting about memes and meme culture is that people are stepping away from the page to write on images, that these images have context, that they set up situations. They set up, right? So when you write on this meme, when you make one of these memes, you are creating something that's in conversation. It comes with a script. It comes with a certain dynamic. Also GIFs. Look at this beauty. Taco Bell. This is the one that inspired the bot. Taco Bell, here's that gun shooting a cheesy gordita crunch through this ballistic gel, which is my body. And look at what my body does when that bullet, that cheesy gordita crunch, goes out through it, right? So anyways, yeah, I think So again, notice we're writing not just on still images, we're writing on moving images, we're writing on GIFs. And basically what we have here is a multimodal metaphor, right? We're basically saying a cheesy gordita crunch goes through my body much like a bullet goes through ballistic gel, right? And it has a similar effect. Gas and just really creating all kinds of shakiness and wobbles. All right, interactivity. There's so many ways in which digital text can be interactive. From hypertext, which we're now pretty naturalized to, the web is basically hypertext, to augmented reality and virtual reality. Let me show you a few examples. Here's an early hypertext work, 1986, Uncle Roger by Judy Malloy. She created this on a Unix, one of the early kind of private internet systems, the Artcom network. Later, she re-implemented it in BASIC and then on the web. So it's a really neat hypertext. Radical karaoke. I'm not going to get out of the PowerPoint anymore because, you know, got in trouble earlier. But Belén Gaché, she creates this work in Flash that basically gives you this text, it gives you images, it activates the camera, it's drawing information from you, and then you are reading this karaoke of political speeches. And as you're doing it, you can activate, it's this sort of a karaoke machine, you can activate things to like enhance the speech with like really weird effects. Again, creating a kind of critique of the very political text that she is engaging. Grita by José Aburto. Let me show you. Is a poem that when you activate it, all right, I think it's determined not to run. So I'm not going to run it. But Grita activates the microphone. It's also created in Flash. And it's listening to you. And it doesn't show you, it doesn't reveal the lines of the poem unless you yell at the computer. So you literally, to be able to read the poem, you have to scream at the microphone. Perfect piece to like put on a library exhibit or something, get people to like, right, and read to unveil the poem.
Where's that word come from?
Peru. So it's a Peruvian poet. Tina Escaja, who's Spanish, is a professor at University of Vermont, created these robo-poems, or robo-poemas, in which these are models that are available. You can get online, you can build these kits. It's based on an Arduino processor. But basically, she created a series of robots where she also wrote on the robots. And when you activate the robots, they have motion sensors, they have cameras, they respond. So how do you read a text that maybe is responding to your own movement and attempt to read it, skidding back and forth? So again, thinking beyond the page. IPO, Play Creatividad, is a wonderful studio based in Barcelona where they create what Bárbara Bordalejo, a scholar, calls born-again digital literature. They basically are creating editions for touchscreen devices so you can read these works by Edgar Allan Poe, and they have interactive elements. So in The Telltale Heart, when one of the characters kills someone and dismembers the body, you have to dismember the body as to read further. They have sound, they have animation, they are creating these really immersive experiences of the stories and the poetry. Tanner Kuhai, let's see if we can get this video to work. Oh yeah. So this is based in England. Andy Campbell collaborated with an Indian scholar, poet, and wrote this poem in this water cave. So you wear your virtual reality gear, you go into this water cave and you explore to be able to read that text, follow that little stream of text. Again, writing doesn't have to be on the page. It could be in its own virtual environment. And that helps how we receive and understand and appreciate the word. So to kind of wrap things up, we need to think of these new paradigms, these new spaces, these new challenges, right? Writing can happen on any space and in time. Images, video, music, augmented reality, virtual reality, and more. One can writing machines, generating text within a carefully defined field of possibilities. It's what I call distant writing. We don't write the text directly. We write the machine that then generates the texts. We created a bot in class earlier today that generates new tacos and new menu items for Taco Hell, well, Taco Bell, but that is, you know, it's kind of a critique of this super combinatorial fast food chain that will dare to try anything to just sell basically the same thing repackaged. I think the literary establishment is slowly recognizing digital writing modalities, even as it is still invested in print traditions. So, and that's fine. I mean, I think there's a world where it can, they coexist. I think electronic literature is an important lab where we can see a little bit of maybe where is writing headed, what are some of its possibilities. And I think literary markets need to rethink how to monetize digital writing and electronic literature. It's still a little stuck on the book or the ebook, which is just a representation of the book in digital spaces, right? So how can we rethink the book? I mean, if you think of the diagram, step by step, now people watch a YouTube video that shows it. You couldn't put a YouTube video or any kind of video on a book. You could put a diagram. You had to break down step by step. Again, adjusting to the particular limitations and strengths of the medium. I'll end this with the trailer for a wonderful documentary by Justin Stevenson about poet B.P. Nicol. It's called The Complete Works. So take a look and listen. And this is an example of video poetry, writing on video.
This is a pen moving on paper. Metaphorically, this is a pen moving on paper.
Puissante, P-U-I-2-S-A-N-T-E.
Metaphorically, the page is a window. It's not. Metaphorically, the page is a window. It's not.
Plastique, P-L-A-S-T-I-Q-U-E.
I try writing on the glass and the ink won't hold. The ink won't hold ideas, the mind won't hold writing. I try in the dream and this is a pen moving on paper. Metaphorically, this is a pen moving on paper. I try writing on the glass and the ink won't hold. Metaphorically, the page is a window. It's not. Gesture. Memory trace, place to place, and a poem because of it. Part of a poem this time, not always the case. This is a pen moving on paper. Metaphorically, this is a pen moving on paper.
Thank you. I think we have some time for questions, if you have any.
Yeah, we have a few minutes if you have questions.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, him and then you.
So it's one of the things
Sorry.
that
Sure.
I was in the classes on electronic literature. It's one of the things that always gets me is how do you classify something as something that like a kid just made and make it literature? Because for me, is it just like have to do with like the definition of literature? Because for some of the words, they are definitely art, but like literature to me sometimes, maybe it's because I read books, like literature is like more like a story, or do you understand what I'm saying? So what classifies, like how do you define what is literature versus what is a program versus what is art?
Well, electronic literature partakes of many of these different genres. And so I think the key part is a commitment to the word. The word needs to have a sort of a, leading role in whatever else is going on. So there's wonderful video games that are interactive and digital. That's a native digital genre. And there's some wonderful stories and certainly very poetic video games. But if there's no writing, if there's no language art, then I think it's less interesting from a literary perspective, though it may be interesting from a narratological perspective and other points of view. But I think it's that, at its heart, what binds all literature together is a passion for words and what they can do.
I just wonder if you could comment on the whole frontier of virtual reality pieces. I know that there's been a lot, I'm a historian, so there's a lot of attempts to work in this virtual reality world. There's a guy up at Columbia who's doing all the words of Henry Kissinger and mapping them in terms of his foreign policy commitments and world foreign policy. And it's really kind of amazing. But I just wonder if you've had any dips into that world at all.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it gives us a whole new relation with the word. I mean, to think about spatial text and moving within it, that the spaces that you create can be so different and yet so significant for the words, right? I mean, like, let's say it's this virtual reality hike through a canyon and the language is arranged and the lines of poet, I mean, like, wouldn't that be a wonderful way to create a nature poem, for instance, in a sort of virtual reality way? Now, the concrete poetry tradition already put language on the landscape. Poets like Ian Hamilton Finlay, for example, a Scottish concrete poet, made his master work was not a book, it was a garden called Little Sparta. It's close to Edinburgh, and when you go there, it's only open part of the year because what flowers are in bloom and how the vegetation is part of the experience. And you go out there and there is language, concrete poetry all over. And what you are smelling and hearing and seeing and feeling is part of the experience. So whether it's virtual or it's real, I think our relation to the word is changing. I mean, I think we'll still enjoy it on the page and very much in the modalities that we've grown used to on the page. But I think more and more we'll see other experimentation, and that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
So you had said earlier something about the hegemony of the page, and I often think of Latinx literature as being counter-hegemonic, and so is there a way in which the digital Latinx born literature is naturally counter-hegemonic, or is that sort of the argument that you're making?
I think so, and I think, I mean, beyond that, I think electronic literature in general is a counter-hegemonic practice, because in many cases it happens in spite of national literature traditions. They're not part of the regular scene with authors and the book publishing world. And I mean, one of the big problems the field has is that its practitioners are few and far between, dispersed. We come together in conferences and festivals and really celebrate being able to share with people who understand and scholars who understand. But yeah, they're frequently interrogating these traditions. So yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much
Thank you so much
for being
coming.
here.